Hi, everyone. Welcome to Pit Stop 19. And today I have Emma Krebs back from the Curious One podcast. And today we're going to talk about, something that's been on my heart a little bit. Call it motivation when walking down the non-traditional path is what I've decided to kind of call it. But first of all, Emma, how are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm super excited to have this conversation because I know a bit about what it's going to be based around. And it's a topic that I actually love talking about myself. And I feel as though I don't have many people in my life that I can actually talk about it with. So, yeah, I'm doing great. Thank you.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things because ever since the episode that we did, we've kind of connected here and there as well. And one of my favorite things is just nerding out with you on things that I can't really talk to many other people about. So also super excited to have this conversation. And I think a lot of the themes we touched on last time, walking that non-traditional path, being comfortable, being uncomfortable, everything like that. But I just touching on it again, and kind of digging into what made you choose what I would call a non-traditional path of, starting a podcast and, kind of having a job to pay the bills and then pursuing a side project that you really enjoy, on your downtime. And so what made you kind of decide to go that way and not the traditional, like, I'm going to go to school, I'm going to get a job, I'm going to work 40 hours a week?
hmm I think it starts with I never really resonated with the traditional path. Like since I was a kid, I never pictured myself really um, going to university, marrying my high school sweetheart, settling down, getting a minivan, living in the suburbs, having kids, or anything like that, or any sort of variation of that, of just like the classic timeline that we have in our society here in Canada. So I always just kind of knew that, and I couldn't tell you. I didn't know where the path would lead, but I just knew that wasn't for me. And I feel like sometimes knowing what you don't want will help guide you into knowing what you do want or do want to pursue, etc. So, to be honest, I just kind of followed my curiosities, ironically, and just started doing things that I found interesting and not um like trying to separate myself from what other people were doing and thinking to myself, is that really what I want to do? And also too, coming down to my definition of success. I think how I define success might be a lot different than what a lot of people in our society would deem as successful, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And how would you define success? Like for you, what's your definition of being successful?
Ooh, great question. I love asking that one on my podcast. And it's a definition I want to explore I explore personally quite often, and I reflect on it quite regularly, and try and get clearer and clearer on what I define as success to help ensure that I'm steering my life in that direction. To me, I couldn't give you a specific answer of success, but I could tell you what it's not, and it's not anything to do with money to an extent. Obviously, I want to live and I want to live abundantly and choose to do things because I want to do it, not because of the financial situation I'm in. But also too, like I don't care about like a big house and things like that, and just like these items that I feel as though a lot of us are working hard for to gather these items to get the bigger house and things like that. And I know many other elements contribute to that if you were to have children or things like that, but it's something internal for me, and it's I would say a sense of fulfillment and a sense of content. But yeah, I always think like it's looking forward to me, success would be looking forward to Monday morning.
Yes. Yeah. I really like that one. And, it's something that I've heard a lot, right? And that
Yeah,
whole idea of being excited about Monday morning instead of, celebrating Friday. Right.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I love that too, where you were talking about, sometimes it's easier to say what, success isn't, right? Or what something isn't. And, I think a lot of times people go after that of like, I need to find what it is, not realizing that like, knocking off what it isn't helps you move closer to what it is, whether it be passion or success or, direction, whatever it might be. Sometimes you need to check off those, different things. And even when selecting a career, right? If you don't know what you want to do, sometimes, a starting place can be, let's figure out what I don't like doing instead.
hmm hmm
And
Well, how would you? Oh,
No,
go
go
on.
ahead.
I was going to ask how would you define success?
Yeah, I think for me, true success is being able to do, what I want when I want and enjoying it,
Yeah.
right? Which is super broad and super, um,
No. I
yeah.
can tell you listen to Gary Vee though.
Yeah,
That's all I got to say with that answer, I feel like.
I definitely stole a lot of his thoughts and then warped them into mine. So,
No, it's just because I just did a conversation with someone and his name's Dylan Mullen and he worked with Gary Vee and everything. And that was literally word for word how he defined success in our conversation. So I think that's awesome. And I completely resonate with it as well.
that's so crazy. Yeah. And, I think that I always need those bigger blanket statements because I change my mind so often that if I try to like zero in on something very specific that it looks like A, B, C, D, it just doesn't feel right because I know I'm going to change my mind anyways.
Totally agree with that. Yeah.
And so, like obviously right now you're working hard on your podcast. And when was it that you realized that's what you wanted to do? I think we touched on this a little bit last time, but going back onto it, what kind of drew you to podcasting? What made you start wanting to pursue that?
Honestly, so for years, once I finished holistic nutrition, I was like, I graduated, and then I really realized that that was something out of interest for me, not something that I wanted to pursue at this time in my life as a career. And so I was like, okay, well, what do I want to do? And as I said, I never aligned with a non-traditional path. So to me, it was exciting because it's like, there's so many options out there. There's the unknown, like, what could it be? So I always felt this push, and maybe sometimes to a fault because I felt as though maybe I was rushing it, or sometimes I'd get upset that I haven't found my passion yet or found my calling, because I kind of feel that everyone does. Like, we've been put on the planet for a reason to do something. And I'm not saying that podcasting is it for sure, but it's a breadcrumb that's leading me towards something bigger. And so I always loved the medium of podcasting, like consuming them, because I liked that you could have meaningful conversations with people. It was a platform that wasn't really based on your appearance or anything like that, which I find is a lot of other social media platforms. And I loved podcasts. I loved consuming them. I learned so much through them. And I was like, I want to be in this realm, you know? So I kind of figured out I wanted to do podcasting, but then from that, it kind of skyrocketed. It's like, I do love learning about people. Like, whether I'm recording or not, like, these conversations I would still be having. And I'm just so grateful to have an excuse of a podcast to have these conversations and to meet people like you and the amazing people I've met from it. And I'm innately curious. So I now have a channel to funnel all of that curiosity into and to share the information, rather than before I would just Google things and like keep it to myself, or like have an amazing conversation with someone and just be like, that was great for me, but now I can share it. So yeah.
So cool. No, I love that a ton. And it's so funny. And I love asking people like how they kind of found their way like on their own path. And
Mhm.
for me, it is a lot by accident. And I look at it and sometimes I laugh to myself of like, kind of going into that entrepreneurship realm first. It really was by accident. It came up just recently. I can't remember why I was thinking about it, but quite literally, like the first thing was some random person came into my classroom. We're like, hey, we're doing like a summer job thing. And I was working at Safeway at the time. And I was just like, it might be cool to do something else. And then going there and then like not even knowing what it was. And finding out it was like, oh, you get to run like your own little small business over the summer. And I'm just like, well, that sounds cool. Right? like not much
Sure.
more thought into it than that of like, I always just like learning, very similar to you, super curious and really like learning about different things. And I like pushing myself and seeing what I can do and experiencing new things. Right. And that's really kind of what has led me in my life so far is just like, very similar to you again, is that curiosity of like, well, this is new, this is exciting, and I feel like I can learn from this. And that's a lot of times how I know when it's time to move on as well. Is I feel like I always try to explain it to people of, you know, once I feel like I've gotten to a point where I've learned, call it like 90 to 95% of what I'm going to learn in that environment, I feel the pull to move somewhere else. And I've always hated routine. like like specifically for what I'm doing, like for a living or for work, whatever you want to call it, of the routine of doing the same thing over and over again. It just like something inside of me hates it. And so a lot of times I'll fight against that as well. And yeah, like for me specifically, like for launching the podcast it was a lot of for my own personal development as well, right? And I've kind of mentioned it a couple of times over a couple of episodes where, I did it to push myself because I know it scared the shit out of me. And, I was like, well, this will help me grow. This is new. This is exciting. And so I'm going to do it. Right. And yeah, like, again, put a little bit of thought into it, but it was like, hey, let's just figure it out as we go. So.
Can I ask you a question on that?
Yeah.
Do you think that you were talking about when things get like mundane a little bit, or you've figured it out and you're not growing? Do you feel that podcasting is a platform that it could reach that threshold? Like you could get tired of it?
I'm not too sure, actually. I haven't thought about it too much where, I don't have any specific criteria about it, right? Where I don't have criteria of like, once this happens or this happens, then I know that it's time to move on.
Right.
The really interesting thing about this is because I have so much control over it, it feels different as well, right? And the other big thing, it was so funny. I think it was Andy and Nuke. I went on the King of Hearts podcast and did an episode. But somebody asked me, they're like, what are some of the conversations that you wish you could have? Or, what are the questions that you wish that you would be asked? And it was kind of like, well, luckily, whenever I have a question I want to figure out, or when I want to talk about something, I just like make a podcast episode about
Yeah,
it. And
I
so,
completely agree.
yeah, and I'm able to get it out, right? And so that part is super cool for me too. And I've been very conscious on trying not to put too many barriers up in it. Of like, if I find something interesting, I want to talk about it, and I don't want to get stuck in a place where it's like I'm only talking about this. And so
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes I feel like I'm all over the place, and at the same time, that's true to how my brain works, and I have a lot of different interests and things that pique my curiosity for different reasons. And so, yeah, I think because of that, it will have like I would be able to switch it if it did become too mundane or too repetitive for me.
Exactly. Like I completely agree. And that's why with the podcast, this is one thing in my life for like the first time I think ever where I could see this in a long term. Like I'm like, oh, like and who knows, maybe next month I'll be over it. And I completely accept that and own that. But it is one thing that I just think it's like you could, as you said, you could take it so many different directions. And like another thing to what you said about I'm kind of all over the place. I'm the exact same. Like, I think we have similar mind frames kind of, and like similar directions with our podcast. And that's why I find it so interesting because we're both completely different. And like you're a male perspective, I'm a female perspective. And I don't know. So it's fun watching us like parallel, but the people are like, sometimes when you're looking into like learning about podcasting and things like that, they talk very much about finding your niche and things like that. And to me, that's like my worst nightmare is like, I don't want to be in a niche. I don't want to be conformed to something. It's like, I want it to be open and I can talk about whatever I want, whatever I'm into at that time. So yeah, I feel that.
Yeah, that's where I go back to another Gary Vee saying where he's like, your distinguishing factor is you, right? Like you're your niche. You, Emma, are a niche because it's your perspective on everything, and it's your interests, and it's not the traditional sense of the term. And I've heard that a lot too, and I've been very conscious to kind of push against it as well. And like you're saying, I mean, very similar reasons. So
totally, I really like that.
And so now, what about the people around you, right? Like you call it your friends, your family. Are they supportive of you? Was there a little bit of, hesitation on their part of like, are you sure you want to do that? Or like, like, well, how are you going to live? I love that question a lot of times. It's like, well, yeah, but like, what about making a living, right? Kind of just in general, your experience with the people around you, how they've reacted, if they've been supportive, if they've come around, everything like that.
I can only speak in regards to outside of my family, because my family will definitely tell me their opinion, and I hope my friends would too, but to be honest, like at least what I've been confronted with has been nothing but support. And that's something that especially once I went traveling, I realized how fortunate I am to have the friends and family that I do. I always knew I was very lucky. I'm very close with my family, and I have really strong friendships, especially here in Calgary. But then once I went traveling, for example, I was meeting new people, and they were talking about how their parents don't even talk to them, and how they've fallen off the face of the earth to their parents because they decided to pick a non-traditional path of maybe say backpacking, and they quit their job and they just traveled the world, and their parents were really not supportive of that. Whereas like my family, everything I've ever said I'm going to set my mind to, whether it was holistic nutrition or going to Australia, etc., they've been like, yeah, do it. And maybe it's also too because I'm the youngest child, and I'm the youngest by a lot. So I feel like the youngest child gets like to slide with certain things because it's like, oh yeah, we already raised two, we'll be fine. But also too, as I said, I have really beautiful friendships, especially here in Calgary. And everyone just kind of, I think they get me, and they understand that I would be limited if I was to follow the traditional path, I guess. What about you? Have you had pushback on that?
It's interesting where, so for me being the oldest,
Yeah.
I was always, I would always, I would call it like, the word that comes to mind is capable, right? Of just like,
Mhm.
oh, we don't need to worry about Jared. Like he'll be fine. Like he can figure it
Right.
out.
Yeah.
And so because of that, it was kind of just like, oh, that's what you're doing. Like, all right. Right.
Mhm. Like
And
he'll
so,
figure it out.
yeah. And so
Yeah.
a lot of the times I was just kind of left to my own devices. And like for my family specifically, to be honest with you, most of the time they don't actually understand what I'm doing. No matter what it's been like, through like entrepreneurship things, working in different companies, like podcasting, they don't really get it,
Mhm.
right? Especially my parents. And then, when I first kind of started down it, like me and my sister's relationship wasn't great, and so we just didn't like talk a whole bunch. Whereas now she is like super supportive, like my biggest fan on anything that I do. And it's funny with my friends, everybody was always, like I would call it almost confused. People were like, what are you doing again? Like, and how does that
I've
work?
gotten that. Yeah. And like you go to the parties, and like it's always like mine is like something will happen, or like something weird will happen. They'll be like, or like someone will bring something, like it's something out of the norm. They'll be like, oh, Emma, did you bring that? And like, I feel like you guys are putting a lot of assumptions on me. Like you assume I smoke, or like I don't like I know that was random, but yeah.
Yeah, that's so funny. Yeah, and it's yeah, so it's interesting to hear you say that, where like me too, I haven't necessarily gotten like a lot of pushback.
Hmm.
Some of my friends would kind of give me like the, are you sure about this? And I'd be like, yeah, no,
Hmm.
it's fine. But other than that, like it has been pretty good, but for the most part I've been left to my own devices.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I you saying your family doesn't really know what you're doing, like I think that's fine, and it's the same, like no one's gonna know but you. And like there's things that I think about in my future that like i I don't really, not from like I don't want to share, but it's just like I couldn't share with someone else. They wouldn't be able to comprehend it. And
Mhm.
so I've always found that as long as they support you, like my dad didn't even know what a podcast was for the first like 3 months that I had a podcast, but still he was like, this sounds really cool though. Like this sounds like you're having fun. So I don't think they have to really understand, but as long as they support you, I think that's great.
For sure, yeah.
Hmm.
And now, like maybe not the people that are close to you, like your friends and your family, but maybe, like that are a layer out, call it, right? And especially a lot of times, like, our parents' generation, people like that, a lot of times, again, like going back to that, when you do get a little bit of pushback, whether it's just questioning of like, well, how does that work? Or like, when you can just tell that they maybe don't agree with it or don't approve of it or don't like see it as like a real job
Yep.
or lifestyle or whatever it might be, what kind of keeps you going when you do hear or feel those things from other people?
It's kind of funny because currently in my life, the job that I have, like, to pay my bills is I'm in the thick of it. Like, it couldn't be more opposite of the direction that I'm headed. And so a lot of times, I'm a receptionist in my role at an office. And so a lot of times people are asking me like, oh, like where are you trying to like move up the ladder and things like that? Like, what direction are you wanting to go? Because usually it's a starting position. You got your foot in the door and you're gonna go up. And like in my head, I'm just like, I don't plan on staying here. But so I'm surrounded by that a lot. And so for me, as much as we talk about how society, there's this pressure and like not many people are doing what we're doing, I feel as though the further I go on my journey of being in alignment with myself and being authentic, the more people I actually find doing similar things than me. Or maybe it's not specifically exactly like mine because we're all unique, but at least people that are following the untraditional path that I can look to for inspiration and motivation. So especially before I had my podcast, this was always online. So it would be in podcasts I'd listen to or books I'd read or videos I'd watch on YouTube and things like that. I knew of certain people. I didn't know them personally, but that were following alternative ways of living. And I would just look to them for inspiration. But now I've actually met people that are doing the untraditional path. And it's been just so empowering. And it's like one of my friends, she's coming out with a book next January and things like that. And so she's a bit older than me. And I talked to her and she's like, this has been years in the making. And so it's beautiful to see like it blossoming for her. And it's like affirming for me that could be me soon. And then another thing though is like when you do have those interactions or those conversations with people and you can just tell they don't get it and they don't like it, you kind of just have to come back to yourself and just, I think, just like confidence in yourself and who you are. You just have to be like, I don't really care about what this person thinks. If it's not going to harm them, like I know me and I know my life and I know what makes me happy, and that's all that matters.
Yeah, I love that so much. And for me, I always go back to like, I don't like trying to convince people, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'd rather show people than convince them, right? Because
Great.
a lot of times it's a waste of energy trying to convince people, and it most times just turns into a fight or whatever it might be, and that energy leak actually does more harm than good, right? And so a lot of times for me, like no matter what I'm doing, it's just kind of like okay, yeah, I see your point. And the other piece of it too is trying to actually pick apart what they're saying and be like, is there any truth to this and how much? And just to make sure that it isn't a big blind spot that you're missing out, or whatever it might be, well, I'm okay with that risk, right? Of like, my risk tolerance allows me to do it. I know that it could go this way or it could go that way, but I'm willing to live with the fact of no matter what happens, like I'll be okay and I'll figure it out. And I think that the benefits outweigh the potential downfalls.
Totally. And some people might disagree with me on this, and maybe I'm not in the right place to speak from it because I'm only at the beginning of my journey. But I do just want to say I always feel like the quote unquote traditional path is always there. So if one day I did feel like, okay, like get out of your hippy dippy life and start, I don't know, pursuing more traditional things, it's always there, but if I was to just pursue that now and not take the risks, and especially at my age and not having many ties to things, meaning like a mortgage or children or marriage, etc., then I would just be doing myself a disservice. And I'd always wonder. That's when I feel as though you'd be living with regret as well.
Yeah, I would say that's one of my biggest comforting pieces, is that I know at the end of the day, I could always go back and get, a job, right? That, like you were saying, that traditional path will be there. And and so much, I'm really trying to embrace that fact of like, taking the big risks, doing the things that you want to do, trying different things while, we're younger, as it's so much easier than, like you were saying, when you're tied down, you have potentially family, you have, more expenses, whatever it might be. And it makes it harder. Right.
Yeah.
So I'm right there with you. Yeah. Now, an interesting one for me, and one that has been different compared to a lot of the different things that I've done in the past, is truly doing something completely by myself and not having anyone to hold me accountable and not being accountable to anyone. How do you find the motivation to keep going and to put in the work because, there isn't somebody saying, well, you have to do this, you have to do, like this episode by this time, or like you have to, whatever it might be. Where does that motivation come from for you?
Oddly enough, I think there's two parts to it. It motivates me more not having someone else to tell me things, and like I'm not an entrepreneur, but I think in the future, like I do not like working for someone else. I do not like someone else dictating my time and telling me how I have to live my life for certain hours of the day. So that's a huge thing on me. And so with that being said, I feel as though part of that is like, I have to work hard now in order to have that freedom in the future of working for myself, however that's going to be. But another thing too, especially with like, okay, if we're going to talk about the podcast specifically, I love it. So I really enjoy doing it, if I'm honest. And that was a huge factor of to like why this podcast has been so big for me, like personally, just that I've found something that I enjoy doing so much. I've tried other things like, and they just always fall away after a few months. Whereas this something it's like, I have not gotten tired of it. If not, it's the opposite. I've gained more motivation from it. But some days I'll be honest, like today, after we stopped talking, I have a lot of editing I have to do and I'm having like technical issues and things like that. But I think it's just kind of remembering your end goal. And yeah, I actually, you know what? I had this conversation one time with a gentleman named Ewan. He's an entrepreneur and he lives such a minimalist life that everything he owns fits in a suitcase. And he just travels the world with his partner, Micah, and they are fitness coaches. And he was talking about how in order to kind of like move into more like what direction you want to go, it's running to something, but also running from something. Meaning I do know what like where I'm working and things like that, and the a bit of the life that I'm living or the world that I'm in right now, I know for sure it's not in alignment with who I am. So it's motivating me further to come out of that world. But I also have something that I'm trying to run to with like the podcast and things that will come from that, I guess. But do you have a hard time staying motivated? I feel like you don't. This is your jam. Like you're classic. Like you are an entrepreneur in all senses of the term.
Well, so it's so interesting where, having somebody call it like telling me what to do doesn't motivate me necessarily. However, I'm very motivated by not wanting to let my team down. Right. And even like when I'm in charge of people, it's like, I don't want to let them down. And so because of that, I'm going to work extremely hard. I'm going to do what I need to do to make sure that, they have everything to put them in a good position. Or like, a big one for me was in my first one, it was when I was running like my student painting company. Like literally I was responsible for my workers' summer jobs, like their livelihoods, right? Like it was as simple as that. Like most of them were students and they were going back to school. This was their summer job. Like this is where they were just trying to make as much money as possible. And I was responsible for that, directly responsible for that. And so it motivated me to do whatever I needed to do to make sure that I didn't let them down. Right. Mm-hmm. And that's where it's so interesting because I've always had kind of that infrastructure, and it's not like having, like a boss telling me that I need to do this, or it's more so of I want to make sure everyone around me or even customers, right, of like, I want to make sure they have a good experience. And so that motivates me to work for, 12 hours straight with no breaks to make sure that, I can get everything done for them so that they have a good experience, so that I don't let them down, whatever it might be. And that's why this has been so different for me.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was like,
yeah. And that's where I like, to be honest with you, I have struggled a little bit with it.
Okay.
Especially at the beginning. I'm kind of finding my groove now, right? So at the beginning, I kind of used that framework a little bit in the men's group where we had our quarterly goals, right? And so I was like, I don't want to let the men down by not hitting my goal. And therefore, like, okay, I'm great to like do my goal, and I would ramp it up and whatever. And then now that I'm not doing that, I'm like, I still just made the commitment to myself where I'm like, okay, I want to put out like an episode a week. And that has been so different for me, where it's like, again, it's not about like letting anybody down necessarily, but I've just made the commitment to myself and I've been able to hold it so far. And so I guess that's more my struggle. And, it goes back to a lot of old programming too, I'll call it. And it's just kind of more, general changes in my life where
Okay.
my entire life, what I had lived for essentially is to impress other people and living for their, opinions of me. Right. And, looking back on it, it actually was able to push me extremely far. And I was able to do a ton professionally. I was able to work like crazy hours and get a lot done and take on huge projects. Um, and then, a year ago when I realized I didn't want to do that anymore, which, mentally I'm so much happier. Like I feel so much better. I know that I made the right decision. And at the same time, I'm like, well, shit, like now what am I going to do anything for? Because I've literally lived my entire life with that being my only driving factor. And so it's been a lot of like exploration and playing in that field of just like, now that I want to do things for me, like what do I actually want to do? And like how
Yeah.
do I do that? And how do I hold myself accountable? And so it's been an interesting journey and a lot of like questioning myself on, again, it's like, okay, well, is this old programming or is this actually what I want to do? And that's where, like, luckily the podcast for me specifically, it's showing me like, no, I like doing this, I want to do this, I enjoy the conversations and I get a ton of growth out of it. And so that's kept me motivated. I haven't been motivated to do the things that I want to be doing, of like actually pushing it more, splitting up the clips, and like, you do a ton of
Yes.
editing. We've had this conversation. I'm like, I
You
hate
hate
that
editing.
part. Right? And so that's specifically where I struggle, where it's like, okay, like I know that to like the things that I want to do and
Mhm.
things that will help me. However, they're things that I don't enjoy, so I struggle to push myself to do it. And I feel myself like climbing that hill, and I'm hoping that I'm almost over the hump, but that's really where I struggle.
I think that's amazing that you've not only become aware in regards to, and we've talked about it before, but just like previously living for other people's opinions and things like that, and now making that shift and then just exploring that and not judging it, but just getting curious about that. So I think
Mm,
that's awesome.
yeah.
But another thing is like, as much as I said, I love doing the podcast and things like that, but it's like, I am the same as you. There is a lot of things where I'm like, I don't really want to, it's not that I don't want to do it. It's just like, it's not that fun or it's time consuming and things like that. But I think a huge thing is like, it's almost like a drug, like it's addictive. Like to me, the most meaningful part of the podcast is recording the episodes, obviously. Like that is the best feeling. And then sharing them as well. That's like another highlight once it's complete and you just send it out into the world. And so with that, I get such a high after that that I will do anything to get that high again. So if that means like doing all the editing to put out another episode in order to build the platform so I can reach out to more people and meet more people, you know what I mean? But another thing is habits. Like that's one thing I forgot to say is like habits, like motivation isn't something that just comes to you. It's something that, if anything, I feel like the more you do, the more you want to do. So I actually, like, I'm a bit OCD about like scheduling and things like that. And people sometimes think I'm a bit weird, I think, because they're like, oh, well, you work a 9 to 5 Monday to Friday. But then like if people try to make plans with me, I'm like, well, I have an opening here and there. Like I take it very seriously. Like, and so yeah, I think like scheduling certain things and putting deadlines for yourself, especially when it's just you and you're motivated, you're the only one motivating you. As you said, like you tell yourself you have to put out an episode every week. It's like I set those markers too, and that really helps to keep on the motivation for sure.
Yeah, no, love that. Yeah. And so what about, and I'm curious too, of like, have you hit any pieces of adversity, right? Like, has there been anything adversity where it really got you down? Um, Specifically around, again, walking this non-traditional lifestyle when you don't have that support system necessarily, like that traditional support system. And, just like whether it's like a big piece or a little piece of adversity. And then how you deal with that. Like, is it the same sort of things? Do you have to deploy different strategies to get through that adversity to keep yourself motivated?
I knew you were gonna ask this question, so like disclaimer, and I was like really stuck on this one. But I kind of reflected and I think a reason why I felt uncomfortable with the conversation was I feel as though I haven't faced a lot of adversity, and like I'm very fortunate for that. But I also like I kind of feel bad in a way, but it's like I just feel really privileged and I don't feel like I deserve it. But I haven't had any major adversity, if I'm honest. But I do find moments of like, okay, I would say like uncomfort in regards to this non-traditional path and things like that. When, say, I go to my friend's house and they're like purchasing a brand new house and they're signing their mortgage, or like they just got a brand new car, and like these physical things, or they're signing a new more, like, you know what I mean, like these things that people would normally do in this time frame of the traditional path. And sometimes I step back and I'm like, am I making the wrong decision? Like, should I be applying for a mortgage, and should I be XYZ? But normally I find I will have a moment of like, oh, I don't know, am I doing the wrong thing, whatever. But I find normally when I feel like that, I explore like what it is that I feel like I'm missing, or like questioning that I'm missing. And usually it's a physical item. It's not like, oh, my friend has really great relationships. Like, am I doing something wrong where I don't have those relationships? Am I making sense?
Yeah, where
Yeah.
you find a lot of times it's not like when you get those feelings, it's those tangible physical things
Yeah,
where
that
it's
you
not
could
like the
get.
lifestyle.
Yeah, and it's like that if you just have the money, then you could get yourself. Whereas like there are some things that money can't buy, which is meaningful conversation, or meaningful connections and meaningful relationships, which has been a huge thing for me, especially in 2020, is just realizing how gifted I am with that and how blessed I've been to have these relationships I do. So yeah, I just kind of reflect on like, what is it really that I'm looking for? And then in regards to how do I move through that, is I come back to myself, as I said before, and think about, okay, Emma, well, like, is this really something you want to add into the direction of where you want to go and how you define success? But also, too, is having those people around you. And so, like, I have no problem calling my dad or my partner. Like, I called my partner last weekend because I was having one of those moments, and I was just like, I feel like I'm doing the wrong thing. Like, I was, and these people just bring me back. They're like, Emma, you wouldn't want that. Like, you have to take everything into account when you compare yourself, an aspect of someone else's life, to your own. You have to take into account their relationship with themselves, their relationship with others, the XYZ, you know what I mean? And so, yeah, I think
Yeah,
that kind
and
of
I think the other thing too is, like the phrase that always comes back to mind is you never really know what's going on in somebody's life, right? Of
totally.
so often everything looks amazing and perfect, and I wish they had their life and they're so lucky and they're so happy and whatever it might be, and you don't actually know that they're struggling, right? Or that you only see the good parts and it's actually mostly bad, or you just, even sometimes mentally, that nobody knows how they're doing,
Yeah.
right? And so yeah, no, I understand that a ton, and it's tough to to push against it, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
it's so funny that you're saying that too, where a lot of times for me, like over like being so strict and so disciplined with like my financial situation over the last couple of years, like every once in a while I just get that urge, like I just want to spend money, like I don't even care what it's on, like I just want to have the freedom to go and like drop
Buy
$100.
things on a whim. Yeah.
Yeah, like
Just because.
yeah. And for me, it's usually like food. I'm like, I just want to go to a nice restaurant and treat myself. And but
That's great though.
yeah, and and then again coming back to it, where it's like, well, that's just for that little kick, right? It's like that little kick, that little boost of feeling good. And a lot of times when you actually reflect on it, it's like, well, do I actually want this, or do I just want that kick of dopamine, right, to make me feel
Or
better,
the distraction.
or the distraction? Yeah,
Yeah.
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 No, for sure. And um, it's interesting too, because for me, just as I've dug into kind of again that old programming, how I used to do things, how I still do some things, right? Is for adversity, like I have always been extremely, extremely, extremely tough on myself, right?
Mm.
And so, like my worst critic is me, like that phrase rings true so much in my life. And for me, a lot of it has actually been like showing myself some compassion, being kind to myself, like telling myself it's okay, right? Like I really want to work, and do a whole bunch on this project, today, but I'm not feeling it. I ended up just sitting on the couch and like vegging out all day. That's okay, right? Like you have more days, like you'll be able to get it done. And really just trying to have that self-compassion for me has helped a ton.
Mm-hmm.
The other, thing that you've mentioned already too is keeping that end goal in sight, right? Of like, why am I doing this? I'm doing this to be at the place where I want to be. Now, I think my big struggle is I still don't have a clear picture of what that is. So I'm like, well, I have a general direction now, but I don't.
Same.
Yeah, right. And so a lot of times I find it harder to go back to that of just like, well, I'm doing this because I want to achieve X, right? I'm like,
Mhm.
well, no, I'm doing it because it is the general direction that I think I want to be heading in my life right now.
Mhm.
And it also leads a lot to me having to go off my gut feeling for a lot of the different things that I'm doing. Of does this feel right? Does this not, right? How long? And setting like specific timeframes is also something that I struggle with a ton of like, and I'm trying to get better at and trying to experiment with. But yeah, a lot of it just ends up being gut feeling. I'm just like, well, I just don't feel like this anymore, so I'm going to go do something else.
Mhm. And I think that's great. And oh my God, I had a point to that. I lost it.
It's okay. We'll circle back.
Okay, it'll come to me. It'll come to me. I apologize, Jared.
No, that's okay. And so, for you specifically, like, working off of that, actually, do you have a specific end goal, like for your podcast right now?
Um, as we were talking about, like it being very broad, our end goal of that we're working towards, I want it to be broad as much as we're like, oh, it's kind of hard when you're trying to. I believe in visualization and manifestation. Like I have my vision board right in front of me here. And there are certain experiences that I know I want to have, and certain places I know I want to be in personally. But I want to kind of keep it open. As much as sometimes my brain is like, oh no, that's scary. Like I need the known. It's like that's the whole point of like growth and things like that is like becoming comfortable with the unknown and things like that. But to be honest, one of the factors is like being able to work for myself specifically. Like if I could run my podcast full time and travel the world to interview different people, that would be like the dream. Like that's the dream I think about. But also to just creating like a community around the Curious One and whatever it evolves into. So there are like certain things too, like more specific things that I personally would like to have come from this podcast. But yeah, the main thing would be just like that if I could do this full time with the amount of fulfillment that it just brings me and the high that I said I get, if I could have that just more in my life and like the volume turned up on that would be beautiful. I know this is really cheesy, but I have a book right here because I read this like yesterday and I feel like it's really applicable. Can I share it?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay, it's a Joe Dispenza, Dr. Joe Dispenza.
Okay.
You can't really see it, but it's just a small quote. It's like, the only thing I can be sure of is this: the unknown has never let me down. So in regards to like when you feel the fear around the unknown and which is just normal for that's how your brain functions, but it is true. Like I think almost having a broader direction that you want to go leaves room for the unknown and elements that you never knew were going to happen.
Yeah. No, I love that a ton. And like, luckily I resonate a ton with it because most people that I talk to, it's like, no, this is very specific. I have this specific goal, right? And a lot of times, like, I just know I don't work like that. And so it is refreshing to hear somebody that is very similar.
But I'm sure there are some things where you're like, at this amount of time, I want to have this number or this many downloads or this business, etc. Like you do need to have that. You can't just like not have any goals. But in the broader term, I think it's fine to be open. But
Yeah.
it's a question I always ask you though with your podcast. Like, and I know the thing is like with you, you're different than me. You have so many things on the go and like so many different ventures that you are pursuing and things like that. But like, okay, the journey with Jared, like, where do you see it going?
Yeah. And just really quick before that, I just want to touch on my goal. Because I dug into it a lot because goal setting is something that I hear over and over and over again about how important it is and like how many people do it and how so many success stories come from, goal setting and all of that. And I think the biggest piece that I've come to realize about myself is that I do set those goals. However, I constantly change them.
Mm.
Right. Of
Mm.
like, I very much so try to react to new information, whether that's like tangible, like external information, or just like internally how I'm feeling of like, I don't really feel great about this anymore. Or I just want to change this number, whatever it might be. And so that's kind of where I've made the distinction in my head, is that I do make those goals. And a lot of times they'll change, sometimes daily, sometimes a couple times in a day, sometimes, they'll stay the same for a couple of months, but they're constantly changing. And so for me, it's reimagining how I set those goals and how I think about them and the traditional goal setting, um,
Mm-hmm.
infrastructure, call it.
Mm-hmm.
But going back to it, and, it's something I've been reflecting on a ton too. And actually last week, I just did an episode where I talked about, I've been doing a ton of reflecting over this past year, reflecting on this past year in the last couple of weeks here. And what I realized is kind of unconsciously, the big theme for 2020 for me has been vulnerability.
Mm.
And it's being okay with being vulnerable, showing my imperfections, getting over a lot of that sort of stuff. I always strive to be perfect for my life. I had to be perfect in every single way for every single person. And that didn't come with any vulnerability because perfection doesn't allow for that, right? So I realized looking back, I was like, oh, that's actually what I've been doing. And at the same time, I felt like that was kind of coming to an end, of that could no longer be my main focus for the next little while. And so right now I'm trying to figure out like what that next focus is going to be. And it'll probably be a very similar thing where I'm going to look back on it and then realize like, oh, actually, so that next focus was this, right? And I did not know that that's what I was doing while I was in it. But so when I first
Those
started,
are almost like goals then.
yeah, exactly.
Like,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
you have a goal of being more vulnerable. I think that's amazing.
Exactly. And I think that's where it always got a little jumbled up in my head, where it was like, well, that's not a SMART goal, right? Like, how can vulnerability be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, timely, right? And that's where I'm like, no, but that was my goal. My goal was to work on vulnerability, and I look for little opportunities to do that in everyday life. And at the same time, I would push myself to do things like the podcast that forced me to be vulnerable. And going into it, that was my goal. My goal was to put myself out there, to be seen, to be heard, and to be vulnerable in front of people. That could be people that I knew, people I didn't know, everything in between, and being vulnerable in front of them, right? And it led to a ton of personal growth. It led to a ton of, me getting over my fears. And at the same time, I feel that, again, switching a little bit, where I think we were talking about this last time, where now like my competitive spirit is starting to kick in a little bit, where I'm like, well, now I actually want to grow it.
Yeah.
Now I want to push myself to, make it bigger, reach more people, whatever it might be. But at the core of it, I also know that the idea of being some sort of, call it like a public figure, has always been enticing to me. And I know that through the podcast, it can be a platform to not only like get exposure for me, but at the same time work on a lot of the skills that I would need to do something in that realm, not knowing what it is, if it's like speaking or just, again, like focusing on podcasting, whatever it might be. But, putting myself out there, putting content, getting the awareness about myself, and focus, learning how to interview, learning how to speak, being on different shows, everything like that. And so there's kind of the both sides of that, where I'm like, I want to grow it just because I'm like competitive and that's what I want to do. And at the same time, I know that no matter what happens, I'll be working on these skills that will help me for the rest of my life.
Totally. That's like something that, and I'm sure you have a similar mindset. It's like the fixed mindset and the growth mindset. It's just like every experience that we have, whether it's podcasting or not, just in life. And like, say you try a job and it doesn't work out, or you meet a new person and you like go on a date with someone and it doesn't work out. It's like, you're always going to learn something from those experiences. And like, even through the podcast, it's like, I've had certain conversations or I've had certain experiences through the podcast where maybe they didn't always go super well. And that happened to me recently. I was like a guest on something and I didn't feel in alignment with myself and things like that. But rather than dwelling on that experience and thinking about all the things that went wrong, it was like I gained something from it. And like I was like, I feel as though you need to get certain things like out of your system. And I was like, I'm glad I got it out of my system on like not as public of a platform and things like that. But yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to loop it back, but I completely agree. Like there's tools that I'm learning by podcasting, for example, that I know I'll be using in my life. And even as I've seen it manifest, like I feel I've always been a pretty outgoing person, but now I feel way more outgoing now that I have this podcast, you know, and I feel way more in a part of a community now, which like in turn provides a lot more confidence for me when like out and about in the real world. So it's always interesting to see what you learn from different experiences.
Yeah. And I love that you said that, because it's, again, on reflecting over my life, I didn't realize like how much that is actually a mindset and a skill of taking the lessons from one thing and applying it to other situations in your life. And, you know, like you were saying, you have a bad experience and you could just choose to dwell on it, right?
Yeah.
And just like, oh, I screwed it up, I wasn't good, like whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can like take that lesson of like, okay, you know, what was it? Like, was I just feeling off in general? Was I just like not aligned with what I was doing at that moment? Was it, you know, I had a really bad day, or I like didn't like my lunch, and like that's what it was. Maybe I'm doing it on an empty stomach or a full stomach or whatever it might be, right? But I didn't realize how much I just naturally did that in my life and how much it served me. And, you know, more on like the professional side of things, you know, I've worked in in industries from construction to like meal delivery to like a restaurant to tech. And, you know, a lot of times when I tell people that, they're like, how do you do so many like different areas? And I'm like, well, really at the end of the day, it's just the little details that you need to learn about each industry. And most of them are the same. You're doing the same things. You're dealing with people, you're dealing with employees, you're trying to sell, you're trying to, you know, finish projects, whatever it might be. And I draw from all of my experiences in all of those different things and then apply it to the new situation. And so sure, I need to learn the details of, you know, the technology stack that we're using or something about that, but that's minor. And it makes it a lot less daunting if you're able to take those lessons and know that you only need to learn the details, because you can apply, you know, those, call it soft skills or those previous experiences, even though they won't be 100% the same. If you can apply 90% of them, you're already, you know, on your way.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. Like I have a crazy resume if you look at it, and it might not make sense and you're like, what? But I'm proud of it. Like it's made me who I am each job, but also to just each experience that I've had or each person that I've met, for sure.
Amazing. Well, we're running out of time here. And so I just want to give you the opportunity to ask any questions. If there's anything that you wanted to say, if that thought came back to you. Yeah.
I don't know if I have anything specific. One thing I do want to say is the vulnerability piece that you have been reflecting on and you think has been a huge factor of 2020 for you is it really inspires me for sure. And like you and a lot of the people I've met through the podcast and things like that, vulnerability keeps coming up. And I find it synergistic sometimes with curiosity, or they're one in the same, not one in the same story, but they are connected, meaning you can be vulnerable, but also be curious about your maybe feelings, your thought patterns and things like that. And so if I'm honest, you started the podcast to be more vulnerable. That wasn't my intention when I started my podcast. It wasn't until probably episode like 25 that I started to be faced with having to be vulnerable, whether I liked it or not. And I kind of shied away from it, but slowly I'm becoming more comfortable being more vulnerable. And so, yeah, I think it's cool, the differences in the vulnerability aspect, but like it's inspiring that you do that, because it, as like Kings of Hearts said, or I think you have said, but like leading with vulnerability, it does help other people. It helps someone like me, you know, when you're sharing, I feel more comfortable to share. And yeah. And the last thing I want to say is, if I'm looking forward to having you on my podcast. So I want your listeners to come listen to you on the podcast soon.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm super excited to be on there. And I had a big laugh to myself that you were literally texting me at the exact same time when I asked you again. So thank you so much for coming on again. I really enjoyed this. I can't wait to be on your podcast as well. And yeah, we'll definitely connect soon. Okay.
Yes, it's always a pleasure. Thank you, Jared.
Thank you.